Polished wood caught the courtroom lights, gleaming like a blade poised for the final stroke.